Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video I wanted to talk about why we should choose Christianity instead of Islam, and a sort of like why we should choose the Trinity as a way of like expressing God's divine nature as one, instead of kind of the view that Muslims have of Allah. So in this video I wanted to go over an argument that can be laid out for why the triune God is it's a better explanation than Allah. So let's just get right into it. So the argument goes like this: that we know that God is all loving. God's infinitely loving, right? He's infinite in his love, and he has to be infinite in his love, and God has to be infinite in his love because of his very existence. If he's not infinite in his love, then he's not infinite in something, therefore he's not infinite, therefore he can't exist, because he wouldn't be God. So in Christianity, and especially in scholasticism, we define him as the infinite, so he must be infinitely loving. And so we do believe that he is infinitely loving, right? And we can agree with Muslims that God is infinitely loving, because I know one of the many names that they have for Allah is Al-Wahid, which is all loving. So we can agree on that, right? So if we say that God is this, if we say that God is infinitely loving, but there arises a problem. At one point, we did not exist, therefore God had nothing else for him to love. Now, there was nothing else for him to love, therefore at that point he wasn't loving, therefore he can't be infinitely loving. Except the Trinitarian view explains this by saying that each person of the Trinity loves the other person of the Trinity, and they're distinct persons based on like the order of their procession, so they are able to love one another and depend on one another. And so this explains the Trinity, and this is kind of like a little bit of an iffy argument, because it really doesn't, it kind of defends the Trinity, and it's not really an argument for the Trinity, because it doesn't exactly have to be three. It could be like two, but that's just besides the point. This argument is only made to like it's not really made in defense of the Trinity, just kind of to refute the conception of Allah. So basically, how would Muslims explain this? And so this is the argument, that how would Muslims then explain that God is Al-Wahid, infinitely loving, if he is not expressed in this triune form? Because at one point there was nothing else for him to love, therefore he's not infinitely loving. Therefore the conception of Allah cannot exist, because he's not infinitely loving. And now I've brought this up to Muslims before, and I've gotten one response that I've gotten is that in Islamic theology they have that something called I don't know exactly what it's called, but they describe that that they have to make this distinction between the attributes of God's essence and the attributes of God's will. And so they said that yes, it is true that omnipotence is an attribute of God's essence, but that Al-Wahid, all loving, is an attribute of God's will. And so they explained it to me like that since all loving is an attribute, but they told me that it was an attribute of God's will. Therefore, he could choose. In his will, he's infinitely loving, but he, by his will, can choose who he loves. And so that's how they explain that thing. And so this kind of distinction still kind of, for me at least, it didn't really answer the question that Like, how would you explain it? Because still, at one point we didn't exist, therefore his will had nothing else to love. Even if he didn't want to choose to love something yet, in order for that attribute to be there, he has to practice it, and like it doesn't really make sense to me in my brain. But I know. And then also, there's in Christianity there's this essential doctrine of divine simplicity, that all things are a part of God's. All of his attributes are of his essence. God is all loving. God is all powerful. God is all these things. It's a part of his essence. And so I feel like it's a little bit futile to kind of make this distinction that it has to be a part of God's will, because I mean it's like throughout like theology and like in history, it's always been like that in order for God to exist, things like all loving must be a part of his essence. For example, in the ontological argument, they lay out that if we define God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, then God must exist, because to exist is greater than to not exist. And so, I mean, it's kind of in the name of the argument itself, the ontological argument, the argument of his being, of his nature. And so his essence must contain these attributes in order for him to exist, because in his essence he has to be infinitely loving, because if in his essence he's not infinitely loving, then there's a problem in his ontology, and therefore we can't like argue for his existence. But obviously this is in terms of the ontological argument, so you know. But still, like, it's kind of necessary for his ontology to contain these attributes such as all loving. And divine simplicity says that these attributes are of his essence. So, that was basically it. I don't know if that made sense. I definitely was yapping a lot there, but I hope you enjoyed this video, and please correct me if I'm wrong on anything, but I cannot conceptualize that idea of I can conceptualize it, but I don't know how it defends kind of the argument that I laid out there. I hope you enjoyed, and God bless you.